Part 1. The Routine Flight. The flight was supposed to be just another routine trip. Passengers boarded, took their seats, and prepared for takeoff. Among them was John Cena, the WWE superstar, who had opted for a commercial flight due to a last-minute change in his travel plans. He kept a low profile, his cap pulled down and sunglasses on, hoping to avoid attention. The cabin was filled with the usual mix of families, business travelers, and tourists. Everything seemed normal until John noticed a man in the back row. The man was fidgeting, his hands never leaving his jacket pocket. He kept glancing around, his foot tapping nervously. John's instincts kicked in. Something about this guy felt off, but he brushed it aside, thinking maybe the man was just anxious about flying. The plane took off without incident, and the hum of the engines lulled most passengers into a sense of calm. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The flight attendant, a tall woman named Sarah, walked down the aisle, her uniform crisp and her smile warm. She paused near John's row, her eyes briefly meeting his. "Everything okay, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but professional. John nodded, forcing a smile. "Just fine, thanks." But his eyes flicked back to the man in the back row. The man's name was Ethan, though no one knew that yet. He wore a dark green jacket, its fabric rough and slightly frayed at the edges. His hair was unkempt, a messy mop of brown curls that fell over his forehead. His hands, still buried in his pockets, clenched and unclenched nervously. His eyes darted around the cabin, never settling on one thing for too long. John leaned back in his seat, his broad shoulders filling the space. He wore a simple white t-shirt and jeans, his muscular frame impossible to miss. His cap, a faded navy blue, was pulled low over his forehead, casting a shadow over his face. The golden hour light streaming through the windows gave the cabin a warm, almost romantic glow, but the tension in the air was anything but harmonious. Suddenly, Ethan stood up. His movements were jerky, erratic. He walked toward the front of the plane, his hands still hidden in his jacket. Sarah, the flight attendant, approached him, her voice firm but polite. "Sir, please return to your seat." Ethan ignored her. His eyes were wild, his breathing heavy. Sarah repeated her request, her voice tinged with urgency. "Sir, I need you to sit down now." And then it happened. Ethan spun around, revealing a small black device in his hand. "Sit down," he barked, his voice shaking with rage. The passengers gasped. John Cena, seated a few rows away, immediately tensed. This was no ordinary passenger. The flight had settled into that quiet rhythm you get at cruising altitude. The engines hummed steadily, a soothing background noise that lulled most passengers into a kind of drowsy calm. Some flipped through magazines, others scrolled on their phones, and a few even dozed off, heads tilted awkwardly against the window or resting on inflatable neck pillows. But John? He was wide awake, his senses sharp, like an animal sensing a storm before it hits. And then it happened. About 30 minutes in, the man in the back row, the one who'd been fidgeting since takeoff, suddenly stood up. Not casually, not like someone stretching their legs after sitting too long. No, this was jerky, erratic. His movements were sharp, almost mechanical, as if he was fighting some internal battle. The flight attendants exchanged quick, worried glances. One of them, a tall woman with a warm smile named Sarah, approached him cautiously. "Sir," she said, her voice polite but firm, "please return to your seat." The man ignored her completely, his hand still buried deep in the pocket of his leather jacket. Sarah tried again, her tone more urgent this time. "Sir, for your safety and the safety of others, please sit down." That's when things took a turn. The man spun around abruptly, his face twisted with anger. In his hand, he held a small black device. It wasn't immediately clear what it was, but the way he brandished it sent a chill through the cabin. "Sit down," he barked, his voice shaking with rage. The passengers gasped collectively, the sound rippling through the plane like a wave. A mother clutched her child closer, whispering something reassuring but unconvincing. A businessman froze mid-text, his phone hovering inches from his lap. And John Cena, seated a few rows away, immediately tensed. This was no ordinary passenger. John's mind raced. What is that device? What does he want? He kept his expression neutral, his body still, but inside, adrenaline surged. He scanned the cabin quickly, taking in every detail. The man's posture was aggressive, his free hand clenched into a fist. His eyes darted around wildly, as if searching for something for someone. Sarah, the flight attendant, took a cautious step back, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "Sir, let's not do anything rash," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. But the man wasn't listening. He gripped the device tighter, his knuckles white, and glared at her like she was the enemy. John's heart pounded. He knew this moment, this exact kind of tension. It was the same feeling he got in the ring right before a big match, when the crowd went silent and all that mattered was the next move. Only this wasn't scripted. This was real. The man's voice cut through the cabin like a knife, sharp and cold. "This plane is now under my control," he declared, his words echoing off the walls. His grip tightened around the small black device in his hand, holding it up for everyone to see. "Do as I say, and no one gets hurt." Panic spread faster than wildfire. A woman near the front screamed, clutching her young daughter to her chest. An elderly man muttered something under his breath, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his seatbelt. Even the flight attendants froze momentarily, their training colliding with sheer disbelief. What was happening? Was this real? John Cena's mind raced. What is that device? A detonator? Something else? He couldn't be sure. But one thing was clear, this guy wasn't bluffing. The man's eyes darted around the cabin, wild and unpredictable, landing briefly on John before narrowing in recognition. "You," the man barked, pointing the device toward John. "You stay out of this, Cena. This isn't one of your wrestling matches." John raised his hand slowly, palms out, showing he meant no harm. His deep voice cut through the chaos, calm but commanding. "Hey, buddy," he said, leaning forward slightly in his seat. "Let's talk this through. What do you want?" The man hesitated for a split second, his gaze flickering between John and the other passengers. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually respond. But then his expression hardened again, and he tightened his grip on the device. "You don't understand," he snapped. "One wrong move, and we all go down." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Passengers exchanged terrified glances, some whispering prayers, others clutching their loved ones tightly. A businessman in a crisp suit sat rigidly in his seat, his face pale, while a teenage boy next to him buried his head in his hands. John's heart pounded, but he kept his composure. He'd faced tough opponents before, men who wanted to take him down in the ring, but this was different. This wasn't about winning a match. This was about saving lives. And he knew he had to act carefully. One wrong move, and it could all end here. The man's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. "This plane is now under my control," he repeated, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. He waved the small black device menacingly, ensuring everyone saw it. "Do as I say, or we all go down." John Cena's mind was racing faster than ever. What does he want? What's his endgame? But more importantly, how do I stop him without getting Anion killed? He couldn't just rush in not with that device in the man's hand. One wrong move, and the entire plane could become a tragedy. The man barked orders at the flight attendants, his voice sharp and commanding. "Lock the cockpit door! Cut off communication with the ground!" Sarah, the tall flight attendant, hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting toward John as if seeking guidance, but she had no choice. With a reluctant nod, she signaled to her colleague, and they moved quickly to comply. And then came the twist that made John's blood run cold. The man revealed he wasn't alone. "Stand up," he shouted, his voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. Two other passengers sewn near the front and another closer to the middle slowly rose from their seats. Their faces were grim, their movements deliberate. One held a sharpened piece of metal, its jagged edge glinting ominously in the golden hour light streaming through the windows. The other clutched a garrote wire, thin but deadly, coiled tightly in his fist. The passengers gasped again, their fear palpable. A mother whispered something to her child, trying to keep him calm, while an elderly woman began to sob quietly. The businessman who'd been frozen in his seat moments ago now gripped the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. John's instincts kicked into overdrive. 3 of them. 3 threats. The man with the detonator was clearly the leader, the one calling the shots. But the others weren't just bystanders. They were accomplices, armed, and dangerous. John knew he had to act fast, but carefully. If he could neutralize the detonator, he might have a chance. He discreetly unbuckled his seatbelt, his eyes scanning the cabin for any advantage, his muscles coiled like springs ready to explode into action if needed. But he forced himself to stay still, to wait for the right moment. Timing was everything. The man with the detonator paced back and forth, his erratic movements making it hard to predict what he'd do next. His accomplices stood guard, their weapons at the ready. The tension in the cabin was unbearable, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. John's thoughts raced. If I can get close enough, I might be able to disarm him. But how? He glanced around, taking in every detail. The layout of the seats, the distance between him and the man, the positions of the accomplices. His years of wrestling had taught him how to read opponents, how to anticipate their moves, but this wasn't the ring. This was life and death. He noticed the way the man kept glancing at the cockpit door, as if worried someone might try to break through. He also noticed how the accomplice with the garrote wire kept shifting his weight, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin. And then there was the third man, the one with the sharpened metal. He seemed more confident, almost eager, like he was waiting for an excuse to use his weapon. John's jaw tightened. I have to act soon, before they realize what I'm planning. He took a slow, deep breath, steadying himself. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had faced tough opponents before, men who wanted to take him down in the ring, but this was different. This wasn't about winning a match. This was about saving lives. The cabin felt like a pressure cooker, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Every breath seemed heavier, every second stretched longer than the last. John Cena sat motionless in his seat, his mind working overtime. I have to act now, but how? He couldn't just leap into action not with 3 armed men and over 100 innocent lives at stake. The man with the detonator, clearly the leader, was pacing now, his movements jerky and unpredictable. His eyes darted around the cabin, scanning for any sign of resistance. He barked orders at the flight attendants, his voice sharp and commanding. No one moves, no one talks. John watched him closely, analyzing every twitch, every step. This is my chance. Slowly, deliberately, he began to rise from his seat. His massive frame drew immediate attention. Passengers turned their heads, some gasping softly, others whispering prayers under their breath. The leader spun around, his eyes widening in alarm as he saw John standing. I said sit down, he shouted, his finger hovering dangerously close to the button on the device. John raised his hands again, palms out, his voice calm but firm. I'm just stretching, man. Long flight, you know. He forced a small, disarming smile, trying to appear non-threatening. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the detonator. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. For a moment, it seemed like he might call John's bluff. But then he glanced toward the cockpit door, his focus momentarily shifting. That was all John needed. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved forward, his muscles coiled like springs beneath his gray hoodie. You don't want to do this, he said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a lifeline. Let's talk. What's your name? The man's jaw clenched, his eyes darting between John and the other passengers. You think you can talk me out of this, Cena? He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You have no idea what's at stake. John kept his tone steady, almost soothing. Maybe not, but I know this isn't the way. Whatever you're trying to achieve, there's a better path. For a split second, the man's resolve seemed to waver. His hand trembled slightly, his finger still hovering over the detonator. But then he shook his head, muttering under his breath. It's too late for that. John's eyes flicked toward the accomplices. One stood near the front, gripping the jagged piece of metal tightly, his knuckles white. The other, the one with the garrote wire, was scanning the passengers nervously, his weapon at the ready. This is it. Now or never. With a sudden burst of speed, John lunged forward, closing the distance between himself and the leader in an instant. His massive hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The detonator clattered to the floor, skittering away down the aisle. What are you doing? The man screamed, his voice filled with panic and rage. He struggled against John's grip, but John's strength was unmatched. Years of wrestling had honed his reflexes, his ability to anticipate and counteract his opponent's moves. The cabin erupted into chaos. A swirling storm of panic and adrenaline. Passengers screamed, some ducking instinctively in their seats while others scrambled to shield their loved ones. The two accomplices sprang into action with terrifying speed. The man with the jagged piece of metal charged at John, his weapon raised high, glinting ominously in the golden hour light. The other, clutching the garrote wire, darted toward the fallen detonator, his movements quick and desperate. John Cena's instincts took over. With one swift kick, he sent the detonator skittering further down the aisle. out of reach. His focus shifted instantly to the attacker rushing at him. The man swung wildly, aiming for John's head, but John dodged with practiced ease, his reflexes honed from years of wrestling. He countered with a powerful punch, his fist connecting squarely with the man's jaw. The impact sent the attacker crashing backward into a seat, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the floor. But there was no time to celebrate. The second accomplice was already closing in on the detonator, his eyes locked on the device like it was his lifeline. John moved to intercept him, but the leader, Athano, free from John's grip, lunged forward. Desperation etched across his face. "Stop him!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking with rage. John turned just in time to see the accomplice grab the detonator. "No, not again!" Without hesitation, he dove forward, sliding across the aisle floor like a linebacker making a game-saving tackle. His hand shot out, fingers brushing against the edge of the device as the accomplice tried to yank it away. The two men grappled fiercely, the detonator caught between them. Passengers watched in horror, their faces pale, their breaths shallow. A child cried somewhere in the background, the sound piercing through the chaos. "You don't want to do this," John growled, his voice low and commanding. His grip tightened around the accomplice's wrist, his muscles straining with effort. The accomplice snarled, his free hand clawing at John's arm. "You think you're a hero?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. John didn't respond. Instead, he twisted sharply, using his weight and leverage to overpower the man. With a final, decisive motion, he wrenched the detonator free and hurled it toward the flight attendants. "Secure it!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise like a foghorn. Sarah, the tall flight attendant, reacted instantly. She scooped up the device and rushed it to the front of the plane, locking it inside a storage compartment. Her hands trembled, but her movements were deliberate, her training kicking in despite the fear coursing through her veins. Meanwhile, Ethanthi Leader wasn't done yet. Desperation had turned to fury, and he pulled a knife from his jacket, its blade flashing dangerously in the fading sunlight. "This ends now!" Ethan screamed, charging at John with reckless abandon. John spun around, his body coiled like a spring. He sidestepped Ethan's first lunge, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the floor, but Ethan wasn't about to give up. He swung wildly with his free hand, catching John on the side of the head. Pain flared, but John barely registered it. His focus was razor sharp, his determination unshakable. He delivered a well-placed strike to Ethan's ribs, followed by a swift knee to the stomach. Ethan collapsed to the floor, defeated, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The fight wasn't over yet. The cabin was still a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. Ethan lay defeated on the floor, gasping for air, but the accomplice with the garrote wire wasn't about to give up. He lunged toward John from behind, his movements quick and silent, like a predator stalking its prey. John spun around just in time, his instincts screaming danger. But before he could react fully, something unexpected happened. A passenger man seated near the aisle leapt into action. It was the former Marine John had noticed earlier, his face calm but determined. With a swift tackle, he brought the accomplice crashing to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, the garrote wire slipping from the accomplice's grasp and clattering to the floor. Passengers screamed again, some cheering for the Marine, others shouting warnings. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of fear and adrenaline. John moved to help, but Ethan, now crawling on his hands and knees, scrambled toward the storage compartment where Sarah had locked the detonator. His desperation was palpable, his movements frantic. "No!" John shouted, diving forward once more. He grabbed Ethan by the collar, yanking him backward with sheer force. Ethan thrashed wildly, clawing at John's arms, but John's grip was unbreakable. "You're done," John growled, his voice low and commanding. He pinned Ethan to the floor, his knee pressing firmly against the man's back. Ethan struggled, but it was futile. Meanwhile, the Marine had gained the upper hand on the accomplice. With a final, decisive move, he pinned the man face down on the floor, using his body weight to keep him immobilized. The accomplice groaned in pain, his resistance fading as exhaustion set in. Sarah, the flight attendant, rushed over with zip ties she'd retrieved from the cockpit. Her hands were steady now, her training overriding her fear. She quickly secured Ethan's wrists, then moved to help the Marine restrain the accomplice. Passengers began to calm down, their initial panic giving way to relief. Some clapped softly, while others whispered prayers of gratitude. A mother hugged her child tightly, tears streaming down her face. An elderly man wiped his brow with a shaky hand, muttering, Thank God. John stood slowly, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. His gray hoodie was torn slightly at the shoulder, and the cut on his temple had started to bleed, leaving a small streak of red across his cheek. But he didn't seem to notice. His focus was on the passengers, ensuring everyone was safe. He approached the Marine, who was brushing himself off and adjusting his shirt. Nice work, John said, offering a hand. The Marine grinned, shaking John's hand firmly. You too, Cena. Never thought I'd see you in action outside the ring. John chuckled softly, though there was no humor in his eyes. Neither did I. The cabin was quieter now, but the tension still lingered, like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. John Cena stood in the aisle, his chest rising and falling as he steadied his breathing. His body ached from the struggle, but he pushed through it. There was no time to rest. Not yet. Ethan, the leader, lay restrained on the floor, his face contorted with rage and frustration. He glared up at John, his eyes burning with hatred. You think this changes anything? He spat, his voice trembling with anger. You have no idea what's coming. John crouched down slightly, his expression calm but firm. Whatever you're involved in, it ends here, he said, his deep voice cutting through the lingering chaos like a blade. You don't get to hurt these people. Not today. Ethan sneered, his lips curling into a snarl. You're too late, Cena. This isn't over. Before John could respond, Ethan made one last desperate attempt to break free. He twisted violently, trying to throw off the zip ties binding his wrists. But Sarah, the flight attendant, stepped forward quickly, her movements decisive. She pressed her foot firmly against his back, pinning him to the floor. Stay down, she said, her voice steady and commanding. John nodded at her, a silent gesture of gratitude. Then he turned his attention to the other passengers. Some were still shaken, clutching their loved ones or staring wide-eyed at the scene. Others were beginning to relax, whispering softly to each other, their voices tinged with relief. We're safe now, John said loudly, his voice carrying across the cabin. Everyone stay calm. Help is on the way. His words seemed to soothe the remaining tension in the air. A businessman near the front let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his hair. I can't believe this just happened, he muttered, shaking his head. John moved toward the cockpit, where the captain had finally been alerted to the situation. Through the locked door, John explained what had transpired, his tone urgent but controlled. We need to land immediately, he said. Law enforcement should be waiting when we touch down. The captain agreed without hesitation. Diverting course now, he replied, his voice calm but firm. As the plane began its descent, John returned to the cabin. Passengers watched him closely, their expressions a mix of awe and gratitude. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed at John. Mom, is that a superhero? He whispered, his voice filled with wonder. John overheard and chuckled softly, tipping an imaginary hat toward the kid. Just doing my part, he said, his tone humble but warm. But even as the passengers began to breathe easier, John couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Ethan's words echoed in his mind. This isn't over. What did he mean? Was there more to this than met the eye? John glanced at the storage compartment where the detonator was secured. Whatever it wasn't going to end here, not if he had anything to say about it. The plane touched down at a secure location, its wheels kissing the tarmac with a gentle thud that felt like a sigh of relief. Outside, law enforcement vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their flashing lights painting the scene in alternating hues of red and blue. It was a surreal SIDA commercial flight transformed into something out of an action movie. As the engines powered down, the cabin erupted into applause. Passengers clapped and cheered, their gratitude spilling over in waves. Some stood to get a better look at John Cena, who remained seated near the aisle, his head bowed slightly, as if trying to process everything that had just happened. Thank you, a woman called out, her voice trembling with emotion. She held her young daughter close, tears streaming down her face. You saved us. John raised a hand, signaling for quiet. Just doing my part, he said softly, his tone humble but firm. But the passengers weren't having it. They continued to clap, their cheers growing louder until the entire cabin seemed to vibrate with energy. Law enforcement officers boarded the plane moments later, their movements swift and efficient. They secured the 3 terrorists, hauling them off the aircraft in handcuffs. Ethan, the leader, glared at John one last time before disappearing down the aisle, his jaw clenched tightly. Sarah, the flight attendant, approached John, her expression a mix of exhaustion and admiration. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You put yourself in harm's way for all of us. John smiled faintly, shaking his head. It's what anyone would have done, he replied. But they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stepped up the way he did not when faced with such overwhelming odds. The former Marine walked over, extending his hand once more. We make quite the team, he said with a grin. John chuckled, gripping the man's hand firmly. Couldn't have done it without you. As the passengers disembarked, they were met by a swarm of media and emergency personnel. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the chaos outside was almost as intense as the ordeal inside the plane. But John stayed back, letting others take the spotlight. He wasn't here for fame or recognition. He was here because it was the right thing to do. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed at John as he stepped off the plane. Mom, is that a superhero? He asked, his voice filled with awe. John overheard and gave the kid a small salute, tipping his cap ever so slightly. Not a superhero, he said with a wink, just a guy trying to help. The boy beamed, his eyes wide with admiration. The story of Flight 217 quickly became legend, a tale of courage and quick thinking that spread like wildfire across news outlets and social media. Headlines blared with phrases like real-life superhero and John Cena saves the day, but John himself stayed out of the spotlight. He wasn't in it for the fame or the accolades. He was just glad everyone had made it out safely. As the passengers dispersed, some heading home to loved ones, others catching connecting flights, they couldn't stop talking about what had happened. A businessman who'd been seated near the front called his wife as soon as he stepped off the plane. You won't believe what I just went through, he said, his voice still trembling. And John Seneyeya. The John Senehe stopped them. It was unreal. A mother and her young daughter hugged each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces as they recounted the ordeal to waiting family members. He was so calm, the mother said, glancing back at the plane one last time, like he knew exactly what to do. Even the flight attendants, who were trained for emergencies, admitted they'd never experienced anything like it. Sarah, the tall flight attendant who had stood up to Ethan, gave an interview to a local news station later that evening. John didn't hesitate, she said, her voice filled with admiration. He put himself in danger to protect all of us. That takes incredible courage. But John Cena? He disappeared into the terminal without fanfare, blending into the crowd as if nothing had happened. He didn't give interviews or pose for photos. Instead, he slipped on his sunglasses, pulled his cap low over his eyes, and walked away quietly. Still, there were moments when the gravity of what he'd done caught up to him. As he waited for his next flight, sitting alone in a quiet corner of the terminal, he thought about Ethan's words. This isn't over. What had he meant? Was there more to this than a random act of terrorism? John shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. For now, the immediate threat was neutralized. That was enough. Hours later, as he boarded another commercial flight, this time sticking to his original travel plan, she couldn't help but notice the way people looked at him. Some recognized him immediately, whispering to their companions or giving him subtle nods of respect. Others simply stared, unsure why he seemed so familiar. One passenger, a middle-aged man seated across the aisle, leaned over and said softly, "Hey, aren't you—" John smiled faintly, holding up a hand. "Just trying to get home," he replied, his tone light but firm. The man nodded, clearly starstruck but respectful. "Well, thanks for everything," he said before settling back into his seat. As the plane took off, John gazed out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a breathtaking reminder of how fragile and beautiful life could be. He thought about the passengers he'd saved the families reunited. The lives spared and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Good had triumphed over evil that day, not because of any superhuman strength or special powers, but because ordinary people had chosen to act with extraordinary bravery. And while John Cena would always downplay his role, everyone else knew the truth. He was the hero who saved the day. And that's where our story ends. What did you think of this story? Share your emotions in the comments below. We'd love to know what you remember most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And if you are in the mood for another exciting story, check out our next video. It's waiting for you. Until then, stay curious, get inspired, and keep exploring the stories that make life extraordinary. See you in the next one.